Hi folks, my name is Matthew and I'm an avid certified instructor at Royal Holloway Media Arts. This is going to be an introduction to editing, both on the theoretical side and also looking at some of the technicalities later on in Media Composer when the time comes. And hopefully you're going to find this useful, whether or not you're working on a fictional narrative, you might be working on a documentary or a music video, or it could be an experimental piece or even animation. All of the logic applies across the different areas. So hopefully you don't hear too many noises in the background from the animals and construction. And I'm going to start off by mentioning that all editing usually follows some sort of linear or continuity pattern. And if you think about the continuity editing, basically the sequence is carrying the narrative in terms of time and space. Everything is making sense and the focus is kept on the story using the suspension of disbelief so that you're not getting distracted by bad editing or technicalities. That's the general approach. And all pieces, usually in a narrative sense, follow this. There might be divergence in an experimental sense or for sort of more of a artistic approach. But generally, the continuity is going to determine the main approach and the main principles that I'll touch upon in a moment. And just to take an example of something that's taken continuity to an extreme, you've got 1917, where it appears that it was all shot in a single take. Well, actually, there was about 34 cuts at least that people can find online in that movie. So have a look at that movie. And another reason I mentioned 1917, it's really useful to reinforce the close relationship that the editor will have with the director. So for 1917, Lee Smith was actually delivering every single day on the evening of each shoot so that they knew exactly the next day how to start those shots and how to approach the scene so that every detail was linked. So just think about that for a moment. The closer the relationship is there, the more locked down the pacing, the rhythm, those sort of things will be. But a lot of the time, the editor isn't necessarily involved. But I just thought I'd mention it because there's no reason why the editor can't be involved from the very outset of a project. But yeah, these principles that I'm talking about, I want to give you 5 words that are hopefully going to give you that sense of a compass while you're editing so that you can check at every stage whether or not your cuts are working according to these 5 principles. And the words actually spell out media. So the first one is M, is motivation. Every cut, every edit should be motivated. And what that means is essentially you see a face, a reaction, and then that implies what's to come, which is the next shot, which could be the reason why the expression is a certain way, the source of that, let's say fear if it's a horror movie or excitement if it's a romance. But generally speaking, you could say that motivation would be showing a handle being opened on a door, and then the next shot is going to reveal the space that the door opens up into if it's another room. So you kind of got this sense of you're showing the source and the outcome, if you like, of the action. And Walter Murch talks a lot about the rule of 6 if you want to know a bit more about motivated editing. But essentially, do you need that shot in there? Are you pushing the narrative along? And is it flowing well? And is it all contributing to the general plot and the action? The next word, E, is exact. Now, this is important, I think, because you want to make sure that your cuts are really on the right frame. Every frame is 40 milliseconds. And if you experiment with that in the edit, you really get a feel for how moving the edit in a very small incremental manner really affects how the viewer perceives that moment in time. And essentially, you're looking for the sweet spot where the viewer isn't overly jarred or distracted from the story because it's all about the suspension of disbelief. So bear that in mind. The viewer always needs time to adjust to every new edit. So continuity can easily be broken, sometimes accidentally, which is not good. It's called ellipses. Now, ellipses can be intentional or accidental, like I say. An ellipse is just a break in time in the narrative flow. And every edit or cut that is made can be thought of like a micro ellipse, and you want to keep that nice and smooth unless there's an interjection in the conversation or you want to create a sense of unease or a kind of jarring sense, and be careful with that. But it can be used for dramatic effect if people are talking over each other, interrupting each other. Your story might require you to really play with the exact moment of that edit. Like I say to people in the classroom, once you start to edit, you've got good editing hours under your belt, you really can tell when things are out of sync by a single frame. So make sure your audio and video is in sync, but also play with the video and audio cut points completely separately so that they're not always linked together. And you'll start getting a feel for L and J cuts and what effect does it have to hear the audio before you see the picture change, or vice versa, see the picture change before you hear a new line of dialogue or sound effect or something happening to move along the edit. The next word, D, is dynamics, and I think this is really important with an edit. It refers to the rhythm and the pacing of the edit, and it touches upon the idea that you don't want a very predictable edit in a very basic sense, but if you take that into a more creative realm, you really want to make sure that your editing, your cuts are matching the dynamics of a script. So you might have a scene where there's a conversation and then something happens at the end of that conversation. There's some action that comes in, and you want to make sure that the editing style changes effectively from the conversation to the action, which means more cuts where the action comes in. And it's just a general awareness of your rhythm and your pacing, so that there is rhythm in there, there is pacing in there where it needs to be, so that the viewer feels the sense of change. It's just like with audio, if you've got a quiet section, you're going to really feel the loud part. Well, with video, if you've got a slow, intimate conversation, and then all of a sudden things go fast and there's some action, you're going to really feel that drama. So that's really useful. So far we've got motivation, the exact timing of the edit, the dynamics of the edit. The next word, I, for inventive. I think this is useful to put in there. Can you make something out of nothing? Can you create new perspectives that aren't necessarily there in the director's vision? Or maybe the coverage isn't very good and you just have to try and make something work that's not quite working. So your inventiveness as an editor is really important. Really play with that footage, and we'll see this shortly with the jacuzzi footage that we're going to be using in a short while. You really have to think outside the box and being inventive with all of your footage, even your B-roll, even those little moments maybe where it's in between takes, or it's very common for DPs and camera ops to just keep rolling nowadays because it's so expensive to have that person in that moment. With all of the moving parts involved, they often just keep rolling because they know that there's sometimes moments where there's ad lib or rehearsal, and those can be invaluable to have as a fallback option. Now, A, the last letter of our 5 letters media, articulate. And this is really the main point here, is that we're going for an articulate edit with a clear vision. So if you can articulate the will of the story and with the director's involvement, yes, but with your editing experimental techniques and your inventiveness, you can articulate that clarity of vision. So there's my 5 principles. We've got motivation, the exact timing, the dynamics, the inventiveness, and the articulation. Those are really 5 areas to focus on as an editor. Now, that being said, the sort of more theoretical section being covered in those 5 points, I would move on to say that there's very common editing techniques in your nonlinear editor. And those techniques, I'm sure you might know a lot of you already, but I'm just going to mention them just so that we're all on the same page here, so that we can move on with that being said before we actually go into the editing steps in the actual nonlinear editor. So these techniques, first of all, you've got the standard cut, and it really is a beautiful thing to just focus on where that cut should be. The video and the audio are cutting in the same place, so the clips are linked in the software, and you're really just feeling out where does this cut need to be, does it even need to be there, and that's the most basic cut. Then you've got your L and your J cuts, which are obviously when you've got your sound and your picture are slightly out of alignment with the edit, so that maybe the sound comes in before the picture, or the sound lasts a bit longer than the picture to allow for some crossover with the sound there. So that's quite common to hear the sound come in with the J cut before it transitions to the next scene, and that's something that I'll show you with the footage that we're about to look at. You've also got a jump cut, is another very basic technique in an editing sense, and probably made famous by Eisenstein in the battleship Potemkin scene, where the battleship is shelling the town, and you get all the jump cuts of all the statue animals before you see the destruction. It's a very powerful scene, really, you might say is the birth of the modern jump cut, but a really nice example of the power of a jump cut, and you do have it used a lot now in various styles, but it's just nice to look at that scene and to take it back to its origins in a very powerful sense. You get that sense of how clear it can be with that Eisenstein footage. So moving on, you've got cutaways as well. I just think of spaghetti westerns where you've got a gun duel, The Quick and the Dead, and you see the shots of the people watching on to kind of build out the scene. So cutaways can be really useful, especially on student budget films where maybe you don't have the budget or you haven't had the risk assessment approved to actually show something in a literal or graphical sense. If you use cutaways in an inventive or creative sense, you can really plan your way around pitfalls, and you can tell the story in a really interesting way through suggestion. And that can be that can be more powerful than showing things in a literal way. So cutaways are really useful to bear in mind as one of your techniques. A very common technique is just cutting on action. So instead of waiting for someone to finish a gesture before you make the cut, try actually cutting during the movement. And if you do that with neighboring clips, you get this sense of kind of motion, and there's a real fluidity. And especially when action comes in, if you can transition to cut on action from a fairly static, minimal approach, you really feel the dynamics if we go back to our 5 principles. So you can see how the techniques and the dynamics are interrelated. And just watch The Matrix if you want to figure out what cutting on action looks like and how it can really give a great sense of action. There's also cross-cutting or parallel editing, as it's known interchangeably. So this is when you've got a scene where you're showing something happen in time at the same time as another scene, but it's a different space. So you've got 2 different scenes unfolding at the same time, or it's implied that it's at the same time. So the classic example of this would be Schindler's List, where you have Schindler's birthday, I think it is, and you've got a sort of lavish scene that's juxtaposed with I think it's a wedding in one of the labor camps, and it's really powerful because of that juxtaposition, and that contrast makes each of them more powerful, and consequently the narrative is extremely poignant. It's almost like they're modulating the poignancy of the scene because the 2 of them are happening together. And I should mention as well that you're seeing a lot of in documentaries now, for example, HBO or Netflix, you've got a lot of clever use of kind of thumbnails or screen splits where you've got footage of different, for example, places around the world. If they're talking about like a global issue, you might get shots of 2 different cities and movement, people moving around in those spaces in Japan and London at the same time, just to kind of give that sense of interconnectedness. So cross-cutting can be really good, like I say, not just for fiction, but for documentary and for other areas as well. And I've seen it used expertly in an artistic sense in Taipei in the museum. So you can really see that in different places and different contexts. Cross-cutting can be really pushed as an art form completely by its sense, in an artistic sense, and it can be very, very powerful. So keep an eye out for that one. So moving on then, you're going into the realms of like montages, which is where the continuity is suspended. And it's funny to say, but everyone just thinks of Rocky when you think of a montage. It's a kind of break from the continuity, for the sense of time passing, and you're getting a lot of backstory in a very short amount of time. And you've got other experimental techniques like a match cut, for example. The most famous one being Space Odyssey, where you've got the bone that turns into a spaceship. Very kind of like zoomed out vision of the evolution of humankind. So we've covered now the basic principle, my 5 principles of editing, and we've covered the most basic techniques of editing in the actual software. We're going to go in now to Media Composer to actually look at the steps that you would take with these principles in mind to fulfill these techniques and to realize that suspension of disbelief, which is what you're going for. Or if it's a documentary, you're just serving the narrative. So that being said, I'm going to show you this in Media Composer first on Windows. And the reason I'm doing this is because of the evolving way that people are working from home and collaborating. You can actually learn Avid without, paying for it, essentially, using Media Composer first. And it's a really great way to learn this software. That is the industry standard for 90% of paid work out there. And using Media Composer will give you an advantage when it comes to breaking into that industry. And it's the small things that really help. So let's just have a look now at where to actually get Media Composer and why it's so popular. Let's take a look.